Thank you very much for these nice words and for having me here. Thank you very much for the invitation to the organizers. And thank you very much to the school for inviting me to speak for this very interesting, very prominent, I have learned now, audience. And I shall try to speak to this topic more, not so much from the perspective of Russia maybe, but it is absolutely also of relevance for Russia and the post-Soviet space, as you talk about it. My own background is from the Norwegian Center for Human Rights at the law faculty at the University of Oslo. I'm a professor of political science, also with training in international human rights law, which is, and I've been mainly working with human rights in development processes. I've been working in East Africa, Southern Africa. I've been teaching many years in Vietnam and in other Asian countries. So in a sense, my background and experience is international and semi-global. Not fully global, but semi-global. I must say that I was thrilled by the motto of this conference. It says, sapere aude. Dare to be wise. And even better, the way that Immanuel Kant was interpreting this and the background of your program when he says that have the courage to use your own understanding when you lead your life, I presume, and when you collaborate with others. Have the courage to trust yourself and to make a space for yourself in the world and for those you are together with. And it's not self-evident that we can do that. And what I'm going to talk about today is mainly about sort of, not so much perhaps the personal ethos of doing that, although that is very essential, but about the conditions, the surrounding conditions of being able to do exactly that, to do sapere aude. I have a presentation in 4 points. I would like to talk, or we can go back a little bit, actually, we can go back to this shrinking space or closing space for civil society throughout the world. This is a phrase that has been used, say, for the last 5 to 10 years. And a number of studies are coming up on this from different countries and contexts. I'm adding, though, that this space is shrinking, but it is an ambiguous trend. It is a trend which is not necessarily reversible. It is something that won't last forever. It is something that will be changed over time if enough people engage themselves to change it. And what I'm going to talk about in particular today is to reflect a little bit about the channels for reversing this shrinking space. This means that my message of this presentation is that it is time to move beyond the affairs of this shrinking or closing space, and to think about venues and avenues for expanding the space for civil and human rights defenders and human rights action. We have to look for solutions and what I would call countervailing measures and strategies. And in a sense, that is what you're doing all the time, perhaps. But that is what we also have to reflect on from the academic point of view, but also in a more global context. And in doing that, we certainly have to recognize the underlying power structures and the related power struggle nationally and internationally that is constraining these spaces for civil action. I was I led a research project some years ago where we looked at human rights and power and how different types of power can constrain human rights defenders and civic action in different countries. We had 6 countries we looked at in a comparative light. And we used a very elaborate model of power, both hidden power, open power, closed power, and different types of power that we need to engage with. And I'm just saying this as a background because we are indeed have to understand the powers that we are struggling with when we are trying to open and pricing open spaces that have been shrinked and even closed. So my presentation will be in these 3 or 4 parts. I will talk a bit about the issue and the context, a little bit about the diagnosis of the situation, about countervailing strategies for recreating civic spaces, and I will talk about particularly 3 global processes that I think we should take into account when we develop new strategies and at least when we develop new paths of engagement. And finally, I might say a few words about requirements for change. So, let us start out with the first. Do you hear me? This mic is, I'm moving around all the time, so you might not hear me well. Do you hear me? Yes. Do you speak English? Yes. Oh, sometimes. Oh, so you understand me. Excellent. Excellent. And if there is anything which is unclear as I move on, you are most welcome to interrupt and to ask questions. We will also have a question session a little later. We'll come back to that. Yeah. So, the issue. What is the issue about? Well, according to a monitoring agency called Civic Monitor Global Finding, which made a report in 2017, in the last decade, human rights defenders have increasingly come under attack. And since 2015, more than 1,200 people or attacks on human rights defenders have been made, including more than 400 killings. 400 killings of human rights defenders globally over the last 4 years. That's 100 a year on average. Part of that, interestingly, in these days, very many of them and increasingly more people are human rights defenders of environmental protests related to climate changes and the environment. Alone in 2018, 321 defenders in 27 countries were targeted and killed for their work, and that is actually the highest record in modern history. Workers have been exposed to physical violence and threats in 65 countries in 2018, and trade unionists were murdered in 9 countries in the first half of 2018. Journalists are increasingly being imprisoned and attacked. 262 journalists were imprisoned in 2017, and 29 journalists were killed in 2018. And that is a figure on the rise. And amazingly, Civicus, this organization for civil society, they indicate that more than 3% of the people on the planet live in countries with only 3% live in countries with truly open spaces. So 97% of people in the world live in societies where there is some pressure on the civil society. It's important to notice that in this field and over the last few years, there have been a certain snowballing effect or diffusion effect of repressive laws between countries, learning where one country is learning what works in another country. Often that is used under the disguise of anti-terrorist law, but also in other fields. For instance, and these laws are being, in a sense, they are being copy-pasted more or less to preempt civic action for change or for developing societies. In Belarusian, there was a Belarusian, you are here, President Lukashenko has been quoted as saying, you have to correct me if I'm wrong, there will be no rose, orange, or banana revolution in this country. The Russian anti-NGO law, much used blueprint for laws elsewhere, has been a much used blueprint for laws elsewhere. And especially the phrase, not allowed to work against public order or security and national interests, are used as catchphrases for this legislation. A UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, Ben Emerson, talks about these laws and representing a worrying ideological pandemic. A worrying ideological pandemic. And as some of them speakers in the panel this morning has talked about, hybrid regimes is very much part of the context that we are talking about. Backlashes against CSOs, receiving aid, for instance, from external partners, are often victims of, more often victims in hybrid regimes or imaginary democracies or in managed democracies, as the terms that were used in the panel this morning. One might wonder why this is so. Hybrid regimes are so-called democracies that are not fully democracies, not living up to the spirit of democracy. They might be electoral democracy of certain level, but they are not entailing the principles of democracy and the spirit of democracy in a full-fledged. And it's not built into the institutions. And there are many of them into this world. I'll see that a little later. So this must also be seen in the context of what I would call a kind of democracy decay in Western societies. There is some worrying trends also in Western democracy. The United States of America is falling on democracy rankings. It's been seen as less democratic this year or last year than it used to be years earlier. And there is also an increasing legitimacy of authoritarian models of rule. China's success in economic development over the years is often looked at and looked up to by so-called hybrid regimes, for instance in Africa, and established relationships eastwards rather than westwards, which again is an expression of the kind of increasing legitimacy of authoritarianism that has been on decrease since the end of the Cold War. Some of you who are political scientists have heard about the so-called third wave of democracy, when a number of authoritarian regimes changed into democracies in the 1970s, starting with Spain, Portugal, and the third one was Greece and Spain. Right. Samuel Huntington, who launched that idea. And in that context, there was a strong, from the 1970s, and particularly in the late 80s and 90s, there was a very strong support by donor agencies and donor organizations to support those democratic developments in Africa, in Eastern Europe, in Latin America, and in Asia. Now, in a sense, that built up a huge civil society which hadn't really been there before. And some would argue, and I don't know if you agree with that, some would argue that the success and the very success of this civil society in the 90s and early 2000s is kind of the backdrop of the problems we see today. That the regimes started to understand that this is really a powerful way of organizing something that we cannot control. So the success of civil society, in a sense, also has been part of the backlash, or causing the backlash, as it were. An important observation in all of this is that protesting against the various economic projects has become a very important, risky operation. And particularly when business interests are combined with state interests. Human rights defenders that protest against economic projects are particularly vulnerable, and I will come to that towards the end, because I think that is one of the areas, one of the spaces that needs to be strengthened in order to get forward in this field. So what is the diagnosis about all this? Well, obviously there is, as I've been saying, increasing threats to civil society and human rights defenders. And I think that this actually can be seen through 3 different types of activities, because how are CSO restricted? And I believe that they are restricted in particularly 3 ways. Formal laws and procedures are put in place that restrict their activities. They are restricted through public discourse and labeling. They are targeted in the public discussions and public work. And in closing and shrinking agendas where civil society can contest and be active in society. Let me go through each of these in some detail. In the formal laws and procedures, there are both administrative and criminal law, as we heard from the panel actually, that are being used. In some countries, the right to association, for instance, is not recognized in the constitution, although that is rare, but there is no legal grounding for defending these rights. As to registrations, high fees are often to be paid by organizations, burdensome requirements for information provision, periodic registration are required at a high level, and new fees are being introduced for organizations. There are a number of examples on that, and Civicus, as I have referred to, are giving examples from Tanzania, as countries as diverse as Tanzania and Uganda, to Uzbekistan, to just mention a couple of countries. And then we have the limiting functions and activities of organizations, limiting the functions and activities of organizations. So these invasive reporting requirements, restrictions in the sphere of permissible activities, is certainly part of limiting functions of organizations. In a sense, the systemic nature of this is that the active citizenship, which is the theme of this conference, active citizenship is constrained and undermined. And it undermines what we call an inclusive society. And as I will be coming back to a little later, as my second avenue for activity, inclusive society is now put on top of the international development agenda through the Sustainable Development Goals, which has as its underlying fundament inclusive societies. So what we are talking about, inclusive society, is contrary to the main development project of our time, the SDG agenda. I will come back to that. Worst of all is certainly worst of all attacked and targeted are so-called political and sensitive organizations and human rights advocacy groups, those who are raising critical issues maybe, sensitive issues about police treatment, police violence. It could be sensitive issues about the use of military. It could be sensitive issues about the leadership of the country. But what is sensitive? Sensitive for whom? And sensitive about what? But in any case, these organizations are usually the most targeted. Targeting as political actors. And then we have the access to resources, which is also a way of constraining the space of civil society. Financial restrictions, as the Moscow Center actually is experiencing so much, is a very much used mechanism for constraining activities, and in particular receiving foreign funds. In 50 countries, restrictions on foreign funds of civil society has been observed. In some countries, it's outright prohibited. In Mauritius, for instance, it's absolutely prohibited. And there are use of mandatory banks for CSOs, for civil society organizations. To my knowledge, that is the case in Belarus. You might correct me if I'm wrong. And I know from myself in Uganda. There are bans on certain organizations receiving foreign funding, as you have experienced, in increasingly many countries. Hungary, Russia are cases in case. And yes, and that sort of creates a very difficult conditions for operation of these organizations. What about then the second point I wanted to raise, and that was discourse and labeling, that organizations are being labeled and talked about in negative terms in the public. It's very important the way that the organizations are able to work in the society. And labeling by authorities, stigmatizing languages, is obviously a means of trying to undermine the credibility and the legitimacy of these organizations. Often they are being alleged of being allied to foreign powers, or to being extremist groups, as it is. And according to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and freedom of association, the labeling is done to deter criticism of the authorities, discourage free expression, increase negative public opinion of civil society actors, and distract attention from the issues at stake, the issues that organizations are working on. The media is also part of this, and the media needs to be part of the equation when we talk about civil society. The media might be a new voice, but there are also worrying trends in the media, of course. There are new problems with net trolls, with hate speech, and the use of new media for labeling, for developing xenophobic and racist positions. So the media is a double-edged sword that needs to be looked at very critically in this, and particularly the challenges of the new media, the social media, should be looked thoroughly into. The third area where the organizations are being constrained is closing contestation. In general, this is about co-option of organizations, for instance, by businesses tying the CSO's hands and trade union hands by making too close links. There are obvious cases where CSO leaders are being bribed. I've seen that to a large extent in my work in Africa. And organizations can move their websites, but certainly in order to counter these, organizations that are being constrained in terms of the activities on the web, which is becoming increasingly important. Websites can be moved to web service outside the countries, and they can operate from outside, just like the Moscow Institute is doing. It has to move to another country in order to get out of this. How can we think about countervailing these problems that we are talking about? Or just this was the issue and the context, I forgot to bring that up. It is important to see that hybrid regimes are almost 40%, 40 countries in the world, 18% of world population. Oh, sorry. You can see that the hybrid regimes are quite high. The 24% of countries are seen as either flawed or hybrid regimes that you were talking about in the morning. And 51 is seen as authoritarian. Only 19 countries are full democracies, although these are certainly estimates and can be discussed, and there are different ways of doing it. The number of hybrid regimes are quite high and quite worrying. But let us then move on to the countervailing strategies for creating civic spaces, and I'm not supposed to read and go through all what's here. It is just an illustration of the international human rights regime. And the first arena, or the first space, in my view, is is the human rights regime. The human rights regime, and we heard that in the morning with the example from the European Court of Human Rights, provides a machinery or a toolbox for human rights defenders and for human rights and for civil society. Pressure on human rights directly affects a number of particularly serious and fundamental human rights: freedom of association, right to assemble, freedom of speech, right to access and share information, including state-held information of public interest, as that may enable CSOs to civil society organizations to perform their roles as watchdogs. One question not further explored by me now is that how can human rights law serve as a normative framework to assess restrictive legislation of the civil space of the so-called anti-NGO, anti-civil society laws? This is a very important work, and one institution that you might know about or should know about is the Venice Commission, which is an organization under the European Council, which is working on, with all countries in the Council of Europe, scrutinize the legislation, give advice and criticism of new legislation, and they base their work on the European Convention of Human Rights. There are examples on this, particularly and more recent one from Hungary, which is important. And this is also the case for the international UN human rights machinery. The backbone of international human rights, in a sense, is international monitoring and scrutiny. The fact that states have accepted that other states can criticize them in public, in committees, in monitoring committees of the conventions they have ratified. For instance, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, the Women's Rights Convention, Child Rights Convention, and so on and so forth. Now, this might be looking like a kind of a bureaucratic way of looking at things, but the things that these committees, monitoring committees, are doing is not irrelevant and not unimportant. On the contrary, I think it will take more importance in the year ahead, and you should be aware of what they are doing. Every country which has ratified a convention is obliged to submit a report every 4 or 5 years to the committee that scrutinizes that report in the field of the convention they are covered by. For instance, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And the committee which is overseeing that convention is called the Human Rights Committee in the United Nations. And they are making a review of the state report, and then they are making concluding observations that are channeled to the country for review and for reply. And this is public information. And civil society can engage in that, and it can be used in the public and the media to engage with how the committee is seeing the performance of the state in a particular field. An example from Hungary and the state report of Hungary from last year, from 2017, says that the state party, this committee says to Hungary, should revise a certain act on the transparency of organizations supported from abroad, with a view to bringing it in line with the state party's obligation under the covenant, particularly articles that concern freedom of expression, freedom of association, and freedom of information. This is a way of holding that committee, holding that country to account from the human rights system. And in 2018, the report on Hungary also, in the concluding observations, commented on the so-called Stop Soros package that was launched in Hungary. And the committee says that it notes with concern the recently introduced package of 3 draft laws before the parliament in Hungary, also known as the Stop Soros package. We are in the Soros building now, which, if adopted, will impose serious restrictions on the operations of civil society organizations and of critics of the state parties, Hungary's immigration policies. It also says that the committee is also concerned that the imposition of restrictions on foreign funding directed to NGOs may be used to apply illegitimate pressure on them and to interfere unjustifiably with their activities. Now, when a concluding observation is saying that, it is not just saying it to Hungary. This is soft human rights law that is applicable in other countries as well and can be used and referred to by civil society organizations in other countries with reference to the comments or the concluding observations on Hungary. So this is a finely knit together system that is possible to use. The concluding observation on Hungary also said that the state party should reject the draft law known as the Stop Soros package introduced because it reflects important stop the Soros package introduced before the parliament in 2018 and ensure that all legislation relating to NGOs is fully consistent with its international obligations under the covenant, reflects the importance of a role of NGOs in a democratic society, and is designed to facilitate, not undermine their operations. I could go on with those examples. There are more examples, and it's important to pick out those examples from states, hybrid states in particular, in order to learn about that and see how that can be compiled and maybe used in sort of as a channel for countering the closing of civil space. It is one important component in that work. The second agenda, or second space I wanted to talk about is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, Transforming Our World. I don't know how familiar you are with that, but it is, I would argue, a very important international framework for development over the next 15 years, up till 2030. It's called Transforming Our World. It's ambitious, much more ambitious than the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, was, lasting from 2000 to 2015. And it has in particular a goal called Goal 16, Peace, Justice, and Strong Institutions, which is talking about the importance of rule of law, which is talking about inclusive institutions and civil society organizations. And if you go through sort of the declaration and the resolution of the SDGs, you will find a lot of references to the importance of supporting civil society organizations. So this agenda clearly assumes that civil society, and more broadly the private sector, has important roles to play in implementing the SDG agenda that all countries, all UN countries have accepted. And there is a small but voluntary, not small, but there is a voluntary reporting system by countries into the UN about the performance on each of these goals. That again gives us a sort of important information about how states conceive themselves and look upon themselves as trying to implement these agendas and the shortcomings of this work. So the UN resolution 7.1 from 2015, adopting this agenda, states very clearly that civil society has an essential role to play in implementing the SDGs. It says, quote, "It will facilitate an intensive global engagement in support of implementation of all goals and targets, bringing together governments, the private sector, civil society, the United Nations system and other actors, and mobilizing all available resources." So civil society is being seen as a domestic resource of implementing the SDG agenda. And in the handbook In the handbook for the preparation of voluntary national reviews, these voluntary national reviews that I referred to, of progress in implementing the SDGs, civil society is also mentioned thoroughly as an important organ. It says that one of the founding principles of the 2030 Agenda is the requirement for all implementation and follow-up processes to be participatory and inclusive, including all levels and sectors of government, civil society, and the private sector, members of parliament, national and human rights institutions, among others. Members of parliaments could also be members of local parliaments, not necessarily only the national parliament. And the civil society organizations should play particularly the following roles in the SDG agenda. They should help to localize SDGs, make them local and understood by the public in the local contexts, which gives local parliaments an important role. And there are examples where local parliaments are taking the SDGs as an important reference point for their work. And they should making implementation of the SDGs consistent with the state commitment to human rights compliance, advocate for human rights and accountability as part of the SDG agenda. CSO should also act as service providers, complementary to the states, and for that matter, in coordination with state institutions. And there should be a voice of marginalized citizens. There should be a voice of marginalized citizens, people living in poverty, for instance, and they should act, CSO should act as watchdogs. So performing these functions of the civil society in the SDG agenda requires protection, it requires resources and environments that facilitate their operation. This is a national responsibility, but it is also a global one. And that's why this agenda is so important also for the shrinking space agenda, that it brings the issues at a global level. Hence, it should be part of the SDG agenda for transforming the world, to protect civil society around the world, and to include the shrinking space issue in the SDG agenda. The last avenue I would talk a little bit about before I close is what I call the business and human rights agenda. That might come as a surprise to you, or some of you, but I believe that this agenda is going to be increasingly important in advocating the rights of civil society. I don't know how aware you are with the developments of human rights requirements to businesses to respect human rights, but it is possibly one of the most important and vibrant fields of human rights at the present. And there has been developed a set of normative standards for doing this by the United Nations in Geneva. The so-called UN Guiding Principles for Human Rights and Business. There is also at present a work going on for developing international global human rights treaty on business and human rights. It's going on in a working group in Geneva as well. But I have more belief for the time being in the UN Guiding Principles for Human Rights and Business of the United Nations, which has apparatus to be implemented. And this is the normative framework that we are referring to. Now, there is obviously a business case for being interested in human rights. And certainly this has grown very fast over the last 30 years with the growing globalization of the economy, of the international economy, and with the growth of TNCs, transnational companies. TNCs, transnational companies. I don't have time to go into full of that, but I think this is an important field that is not just driven by normative standards and human rights standards, but increasingly in the business community, as this agenda develops, it's also pointing to the moral choice that business people have to do. And the moral choice certainly is informed about the environment in which these choices are being made, So the environment, for instance, is that a conducive environment in terms of democratic discussion, democratic surveillance of companies, displaying the ills of the companies when they do wrong? Are we in Norway observing what our companies are doing when they invest in Vietnam, and are we exposing that to the public so we can put pressure on the companies? Yes, that is the way that we deal with it now, increasingly. Companies are very afraid of one thing, a reputational loss in international markets. And if you can play on that, very important mechanism, loss of reputation, then you will have a business case for respecting human rights, do no harm, as we call it, and then contributing, at least not necessarily very active in implementing human rights, but avoid violating human rights in the operations. One important mechanism of doing that is so-called human rights due diligence that businesses should do, risk analysis of their operations. And here again, civil society comes in as important actors and contributors to developing that kind of risk analysis for business behavior in very many societies in the world. I can see that time is flying, and I would rather have some time for questions. I don't have much more to say. I don't really have the conclusions on all this, but I think that it is important that we are talking about this as civil society need international networking, but it also needs reflections on international morality, and human rights can be an important contributor to that morality and moral discussion, because this is about morality, it's about normative choices that we are making, and it's about what are the normative foundation for holding governments to account. I think that has to go through what Amartya Sen talked about as public reasoning. Public reasoning is a very important way of dealing with these issues and the discourse that we have. Monitoring and producing of information, data that I have just given a few glimpses of here is very important. And obviously what we want to have, and which is so difficult to get, is the transparency in societies that we live in order to demand accountability based on the rights that states have committed themselves to respect. But certainly that is a long avenue and long story. So I think I'll conclude on those. Thanks.